Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the All Souls Community Forum coming from All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Kansas City. I'm Joe Robertson, a member of this church and also a member of the Forum Committee, a forum that for decades has carried on important conversations promoting critical thinking on the most compelling and challenging issues of our day. Today, we are examining critical race theory and America's fractured reckoning with history. And we're here with UMKC professor Dr. Loyce Caruthers and Dr. Brad Poos, the Associate Director of UMKC's Institute for Urban Education. And both of you, among your many specialties, have focused on race, class, language, and social justice education, and of course, our nation's struggle with CRT. So Loyce and Brad, welcome to the forum, and take it away.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just a little bit about me. I'm a professor of educational leadership, policy, and foundations at UMKC. I teach courses related to education administration and qualitative research. I also serve as coordinator of the educational doctorate program in PK-12 administration. I bring extensive experience in urban education over 40 years. I have been a teacher, a central office administrator, assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction, and for about 9 years, I served as the director of race desegregation at McCrail, which still is a regional lab funded by the U.S. Department of Education. My research involves the social construction of urban schools with an emphasis on exploring phenomena related to race, class, language, gender, and other differences that may influence educators' beliefs and perceptions, and ultimately their work in schools.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm Brad Poos, and am at UMKC as well with Loyce. We appreciate you having us this morning to discuss a little bit our work around critical race theory and critical scholarship. I think it's important to just make mention that Loyce and I are not legal scholars. And so we come at this work a little bit differently. We're educators. As Loyce said, she's spent years and years in education. I too have spent my career 20 plus years in education as well, in K-12 education, and then now in higher education. And we do identify as critical scholars. Our scholarship and research definitely has a critical lens. And we, even as of late, have adopted kind of a critical race theoretical paradigm, particularly looking at Black crit and Black mattering in our exploration of schools as institutions. So we do, we certainly, our work is critical in nature, but I just wanted to make note that we are not legal scholars. And so when we talk about critical race theory and the origins of critical race theory, we really look to the legal field for those origins. And critical race theory ultimately is taught in law school. And so, you know, that's something to make note of as well, and something that we'll talk about, even though in mainstream media, it's often portrayed that critical race theory is taught in our elementary and middle and high schools. I am not aware of, I mean, that's just not happening. So I think that's something just to kind of hold on to. We'll be happy to entertain questions, but I think we had discussed possibly doing that at the end. So if you have a question, please make note of that. And we'll certainly come back to those questions at the end here, but we'll kind of push through kind of a little bit of what critical race theory is, a very brief history, the major tenets, some of the spin-off of critical race theory, including Black crit, which Loyce and I often employ in our work. And then talking a little bit about the contemporary issue of CRT in the media and what's been happening there.
I'd like to add, Brad, before you leave that topic, that many of my doctoral students are introduced to critical race theory for the first time. And, you know, you're exactly right. It's much more of a focus area of higher education and helping educators be aware of some of those issues as they do their work in schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. You'll see here that we have pulled just a brief definition of critical race theory and framing it as more of a movement. Certainly you'll see it in scholarship, but it's also a collection of not only scholars, but activists. But at its core, CRT is, and we should mention too that we'll refer to critical race theory kind of henceforth as CRT, just as an abbreviated form of that. You'll hear that often used widely as well. So just so we're all on the same page. But at its basic, the basic premise at its core, it's really arguing against the slow pace of racial reform, coming at racism as normal in American society, that it's systemic. There's also an underlying critique of liberalism, and we'll talk more about that, but that basically is getting at the concept that's used in critical race theory called interest convergence, and we'll talk more about that here momentarily. And ultimately, it's about truth-telling, and that's kind of our approach to this, is we want to explore the truth, and that's in a nutshell kind of what CRT is all about. Brief history. The guy you see on your screen here, Dr. Derek Bell, is really known as the grandfather of critical race theory. Developed in the 1970s, and was kind of came as a result of what Derek Bell, as well as others, Freeman and Delgado. More recently, Kimberly Crenshaw is a notable name in this work. But it really came about from what is often called critical legal studies, which basically came at the study of law as apolitical, or not objective, and so kind of grew out of that, as well as radical feminism. So it's both an outgrowth of critical legal studies, but taking it further. And so it really, if you look at CRT, you sort of have to go back to critical legal studies to find its origins. And ultimately, it's concerned with redressing historical harms or wrongs that have been done historically. So there's also a historical element here. Much of the work that Loyce and I do is historical in nature. So we sort of consider ourselves as educational historians, but also counter storytelling is kind of what we do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here too. I'm going to let Loyce talk about how this has morphed into education and other related fields.
Well, in the early 90s, you had Lassen, Billings, and Tate, and they used CRT to examine educational policies and practice within schools pertaining to communities of color. They were really interested in looking at equity issues in terms of children in urban schools and other settings, as well as suburban schools, regarding curricula, assessment, and instruction. So they began to look at CRT and apply it in that area in terms of bringing awareness to educators around issues of equity and social justice.
Yeah, so just to give you an example of kind of applying a critical race theoretical lens to work in education, Loyce and I and another co-author of ours just completed a manuscript looking at Black mattering and restorative justice in schools. So looking at zero tolerance policies and punitive measures that have been employed in schools historically over the last 3 decades that have disproportionately impacted students of color, particularly Black students. And so that's just sort of an example of applying that critical lens in education. And all of the research that we've done is really in that education field.
And students bring those experiences into classrooms, and oftentimes teachers do not know how to address those experiences. And so our work centers around helping them to address some of the issues that from our larger society dealing with racism, sexism, and other differences that students bring into schools, and they want to be able to talk about some of those issues. And so breaking that silence.
So this leads into the basic tenets of CRT. And one of those that we really utilize widely is counter storytelling. And that's a big part. Narrative, storytelling, and counter storytelling are, that's a big part of critical race theory. Loyce, did you want to say a little bit more about counter storytelling, or do you want to come back to it?
Well, I'll go ahead and mention it. You know, there in terms of counter storytelling, is the focus on resisting these master narratives. So there are 3 types of stories. There are personal stories regarding racism and sexism. People often tell other people's stories or narratives using the 3rd person. And then there are narratives created by authors to explore the intersectionality of various forms of subordination. So we're going to be telling a couple of counter stories. I will be telling a story of personal racism and sexism, and Dr. Poos will tell the 3rd type of story in terms of looking at other people's narratives regarding subordination and intersectionality.
So we'll come back to that here in a moment, but just to touch on some of the other basic tenets. One is that racism is permanent. It's ordinary. I mentioned that earlier, but coming at racism as the common everyday experience of most people of color in the United States, as well as the usual way that society does business. So this sometimes is, we can refer to this as whiteness as status property. And that's something that Latson, Billings, and Tate, who really apply this to education, have discussed in their look and insight into educational inequities. But this notion that whiteness has meaning in American society, both historically as well as contemporary meaning. Interest convergence is a concept I mentioned earlier as well. Interest convergence is really this idea that Black people in particular, but people of color, achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge. Typically, we'll see that progress is made when it benefits both white and people of color. So that's the notion of interest convergence. The social construction of race is critical to understanding CRT. And that's the idea that there's no objective truth really, that there's no biological or genetic reality to racial superiority. Races are categories. They've been socially invented. They're manipulated. They change over time. At one point, it will benefit a particular race and harm another, and can shift and adjust depending on the contemporary moment. And so this idea of race as a social construct, that it's been created by society and not rooted in objective fact, is critical to the understanding of CRT. And then lastly, this overarching critique of liberalism. And this was when CRT really gained popularity in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Critique of liberalism was kind of a popular aspect of this particular movement, attacking such things as colorblindness or neutrality of the law, or this idea of slow incremental change. That was something that crits or those who were involved in CRT really took issue with. But that's changed a little bit as of late, especially with the movement towards kind of broader conservatism around strict kind of right side politics. And so now this idea of liberalism is sort of, I don't know, taking a backseat, I suppose, but that was originally what crits were mainly concerned with. I want to go back to the counter storytelling now, and we'll share examples. We were going to start with these, but decided to kind of hold off until we got to the basic tenets. And we frame these as these stories that we're going to tell, just kind of frame these as statements of positionality, giving you an idea where we come from, how we approach this work. And these are also examples of storytelling and how it's important in critical race theory. Loyce, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Well, I'll start. Originally I was going to follow you, but I'll be happy to start.
Okay.
As Dr. Poos mentioned, these stories are just a part of us. And so I cannot grow up. I would not be able to grow up in America without realizing that what I represent as an African-American woman. I am the great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Furlow, born in slavery, the granddaughter of Pinky Furlow Mitchell, identified as mulatto in the 1920 census, the daughter of Ethel Mitchell Jordan, whose father was killed by 2 white men in the 1920s and his body left in a field of rural Arkansas. I am the daughter of Demancey Joyner, veteran of World War I and II. Demancey was in Bravo Company, 813 Pioneer Infantry Regiment in World War I, and dug more ditches than actively fought because the Pioneer regiments were formed to serve as road maintenance troops and often used as labor for anything that needed to be accomplished. I was raised by a single parent with 8 siblings when my father died in the early 50s. I was 5 years old. Shortly after his death, as a result of the 1950s polio epidemic, I was diagnosed with polio and eventually quarantined in the segregated hospital of Kansas City for Black people, General Hospital number 2, once located on Hospital Hill in the vicinity of Truman Medical Center. I was one of 10 of 15 Black children who integrated Purcell High School in 1961, and by 1967, the school was predominantly Black due to white flight. I was part of this system that Dr. Poos will talk about that has to be torn down. My tears flowed unchecked as I stood in the slave castles of Ghana in 2009, still smelling the remains of the blood and urine of my ancestors. Our silence about the past perpetuates a form of symbolic violence that extends beyond physical acts to include the social origins of physical conflict used, according to Bruin and Raymond, to maintain, as I quote, systems of oppression and domination within the context of a hegemonic society. We use our constructive knowledge of self and our positionalities to challenge the backlash against critical race theory, often misunderstood. As Dr. Poos mentioned, CRT began as a form of protest against an unjust legal system. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Poos, to tell your story.
Thanks, Dr. Caruthers. And as Dr. Caruthers mentioned earlier on, my statement is a little bit framed a little bit differently in looking at my position within a larger system, not so much on my personal experiences, but how I see myself in this system. Whereas Dr. Caruthers was more a personal narrative around her in her experiences. So I would like to refer to the late John Ogbu, anthropologist, who coined the phrase, quote, involuntary minorities, in reference to those whose group belonging is rooted in a history of conquest, colonization, and/or enslavement. In particular, I would like to acknowledge that we gather in this space today on the stolen lands of Indigenous and First Nations peoples, Kansa, Kickapoo, Osage, Otis, Missouri, Potawatomi, and others. I want to recognize as well those who were enslaved over the centuries-long system of Black chattel slavery and who were forcibly transported to North America as part of the transatlantic slave trade, and whose shackled labor is largely responsible for building the country we refer to as the United States. I want to call your attention to specifically my positionality in this system as a white man whose ancestors were responsible for perpetuating these egregious and heinous acts. I come before you in this moment to commit to being part of the solution. This is not and has never been a burden to bear by those who have and continue to be victimized by the system of racial inequity and whose full humanity cannot be fully realized until historical harms have been meaningfully addressed. We all have a role to play in tearing down this system, but that responsibility falls heavily on those who are and whose ancestors were part of the dominant group. Those of us who are white, those who look like me. So those are examples of statements of positionality, but also more broadly, storytelling as a powerful way to not only position ourselves in this work, but to also provide an example of how storytelling can be both extremely powerful and meaningful, and can bring new understanding and new meaning to this long, age-long problem, centuries-long problem, and issues of racial inequity in this country.
And being able to break that silence as well, Dr. Poos, is also healing. I never thought that I would be able to tell that story publicly. My niece has been doing some research in terms of our families and been able to, let's say, speak of horrific kinds of issues. Sort of breaks that silence and is also healing at the same time.
Yes. Okay, well, we're going to move on now so we can get through some of this other information regarding CRT before we come back to questions. Just want to make a note that when we think of racism as endemic in the United States, a lot of times when we think of this idea of critique of liberalism, we return to the election of Barack Obama and the notion that race says that the election of President Obama was an indication that racism was declining in this country. It's apparent at this point, I think, that that's no longer the case, nor was it ever. But I pulled a quote here from Delgado and Stefancic, who are prominent CRT theorists, that by every social indicator, racism continues to blight the lives of people of color, including those holders of high echelon jobs. With regard to liberalism, many liberals, we mentioned this idea of color blindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. CRT really takes aim at both of those, both this idea of color blindness, or the fact that race doesn't matter, that anyone, the idea of the myth of meritocracy that Dr. Caruthers, I think we'll talk about here in a moment, but that anybody can be successful, just, harness your efforts, pull your bootstraps up and go. And that's one of that's one of the concepts around liberalism, is that anybody can be successful. And this belief in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current situations. And this plays into this idea that kind of convincing ourselves that the election of Barack Obama meant that we had arrived at a post-racial stage of social development. And I think that we can certainly make the case that now, in this moment, that certainly is not true. Dr. Caruthers, did you want to talk a little bit about this idea of meritocracy? And
Absolutely. We have what's called neoliberalism, the idea that the market controls everything. And in terms of meritocracy, there are a number of Black youth and others as well who represent what we're calling Black resiliency neoliberalism. It represents bold efforts of Black people to thrive against anti-Black structural racism. You'll see this reflected in narratives of individual Black youth who wish to overcome conditions of poor schools, outdated books, and living in poor neighborhoods. They do so by staying in school, getting good grades, staying out of trouble, and attending college. And so this whole idea of this Black resiliency neoliberalism has affected the lives of all of us, built on the idea of meritocracy. If you'll just work hard enough, you'll be able to overcome some of these structural issues of racism.
And that's also rooted in the highly individualistic nature of the United States, this idea of individualism versus collectivism, where we often, in the United States in particular, the social structure is at the individual level, that, make something of yourself, which gets into this idea of meritocracy too. I'm going to let Dr. Caruthers take this and talk a little bit about some of the spin-offs of critical race theory that we currently see in the literature.
Well, given the idea that race affects all of us, I often say we cannot grow up in America without being racist, sexist, or some type of binary dealing with issues of differences. But in responses to the structural determinism, CRT in its very beginnings represented this Black-white binary. In other words, we only talked about race. And so there were a number of scholars that began to look at the experiences of other groups. For instance, Crenshaw introduced the term intersectionality, the fact that we are just not we're not shaped by just one experience. Our lives are shaped by the interlocking of experiences. We're shaped by race, class, gender, sexuality, able-bodiedness, and age. As a result of this Black-white binary, the responses of Asians was the notion of Asian crit. It's a framework that theorized Asian Americans' racial realities, including the exclusion of a national identity, are concerns of this group, or were concerns and still remain concerns. The whole idea of the model minority myth, which sort of sets Asian Americans against the struggles of other people of color, and overall having the construction of a collective historical narrative. Then you have, emerging from critical race theory, Black crit, and it emerges a theory of Blackness to confront anti-Blackness. The idea that anti-Blackness is embedded in a theory of Afro-pessimism that insists Black people exist in the imagination of the slave. A theory that insists that Black is a despised thing in and of itself, in opposition to all that is pure, humane, human, and white. And then you had Lat crit that emerged in the early 90s, 1995, by scholars who wanted to use the foundation of critical race theory to address the inequities that Latinx people felt. These inequities due to race, class, gender, and sexuality, related to immigration status, language, ethnicity, and culture. And then there was a notion of what we call queer theory that focused on sexuality and the normalization of sexuality in our society as a heterogeneous kind of a narrative. Queer crit began to apply jurisprudence and critiques of the intersections of race and sexual orientation for people of color to examine how anti-racist literature and the movements marginalize their concerns and perspectives. The other response to this Black and white binary was tribal crit, which highlights racism specific to indigenous people, problems of assimilation, centrality of sovereignty and self-determination, and the importance of tribal philosophies and traditions. And so you had, as I mentioned, several responses to that Black-white binary that we created in the larger society, where we only looked at race in terms of Blackness and whiteness.
So as we think about how CRT has grown, this notion of intersectionality, these spin-offs that are more inclusive of the whole human experience in the United States, we find that critical race theory has become a little bit more mainstream. Whereas, nobody was talking about critical race theory 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Now it's hard to avoid turning on the news and hearing something about critical race theory. I thought it was interesting. There was an article in the Washington Post in June of 21. So not too terribly long ago. And the title of the article was Republicans Spurred by an Unlikely Figure See Political Promise in Targeting Critical Race Theory. And this originated with this gentleman you see here on the screen, Christopher Rufo, who is a former documentary filmmaker, actually worked at PBS, turned conservative activist. And if you just Google his name and look him up, you'll find several interviews with him on mainstream media, not just Fox, but MSNBC and others, where he has been asked about his role in advancing the notion that critical race theory is threatening the institutions, particularly federal institutions of our government. The story goes that that former President Trump was watching Fox News and Christopher Rufo came on discussing critical race theory, describing it as a default ideology of the federal bureaucracy being weaponized against the American people, and betting all sorts of different aspects of the federal government. And it was not long thereafter that President Trump initiated his executive order. And I remember this kind of coming down the pike here at UMKC and the work that we were doing, where this became sort of real world, where in the last days of the Trump presidency, that because of this executive order, that we were having conversations even at our level about what we could or could not say. And so the kind of the trickle down. Rufo has described CRT, critical race theory, as cult indoctrination. And on his Twitter account, he wrote in March of 21, quote, "We have successfully frozen their brand critical race theory into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under the brand category." And so just a point of reference that this was the approach. And so the shift for CRT from liberalism, neoliberalism, to kind of in-your-face conservatism now being the major threat to critical race theory certainly is sort of the reality in this moment, and this has consequences. And so, I forgot to put this in there. I'll read this to you. CRT does not attribute racism to white people as individuals or even to entire groups of people. Simply put, critical race theory states that U.S. social institutions, the criminal justice system, education system, labor market, housing market, healthcare system are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to differential outcomes by race. And really what the case that Rufo and some of these other conservative think tankers are really going after is that CRT attributes all racism to white people. And that is certainly not what the theory is about. It's about truth-telling, as we mentioned early on. It's about exploring the systemic nature of racism and the fact that racism and race is endemic to the United States, etc. But this is how this has been framed by some of these conservative pundits to make CRT all about the fact that it's, theorizing that white people, that racism is attributable to white people. And
what's interesting too, just to add to that, Dr. Poos, is also, we had all of these different crits that emerged as a result of people wanting to tell the truth about their conditions. There's also a crit called parent crit. And so there are lots of reactions to this binary of whiteness and blackness in our society. And people simply want to be able to tell their stories and to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. In terms of where this has brought us to this moment, we have 9 states: Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Arizona, and North Dakota, who have passed legislation banning or restricting the teaching of critical race theory. We have as you can see by this map, there are new bills that have been introduced, including in Missouri, around limiting or banning or restricting discussions around racism and or critical race theory. There are just a couple of states where critical racism bans have failed. You can see there Arizona and Mississippi, and only one state, Delaware, that has reaffirmed its teaching of Black history and anti-racism. This map's kind of hard to see. And then quite a few states that have not taken any action. But I think obviously the fact that 9 states in this moment have either banned or restricted the teaching of critical race theory or of systemic racism is disconcerting, certainly.
As we talked about this issue, Dr. Poos, if you kind of recall some of our earlier conversations, you know, this fear is just kind of what I would call ridiculous. I mean, even if you look at what's going on in 6 through 12 schools in terms of social studies, these standards that we have here have no mention of critical race theory. And so, as you mentioned, it is a fear growing out of white supremacy and all of the other things that have been going on in our society regarding race.
Yeah.
Elementary kids are not exposed to critical race theory, not even at the high school level are students exposed to critical race theory. It's such a complex and abstract idea in the first place, but there are standards around examining social structures and stratification in terms of societies and the relationships between people. Standards around looking at key events of continuing US movements to realize equal rights for women and other groups or other people of color.
You know, there's so much being talked about critical race theory and exploring systemic racism that I think we're finding too that teachers are, you know, they're hearing this as well. And there's fear there. What can I say? What can't I say? Can we talk about systemic racism? Can we talk about some of these really important, meaningful issues? You know, the fear that that there's going to be some sort of consequence, either federal or state level consequence for those conversations is indeed impacting the curriculum. But there's nothing in these standards. These are Missouri grade level expectations and part of the standards for Missouri schools. I mean, there's nothing in there about critical race theory, but I think obviously we're concerned that all of this rhetoric and what's happening with banning and restricting critical race theory is that now these conversations are being limited in our schools. And they're not happening as a result of that.
And then what does this really do for our children in terms of teaching them about equity, democracy, and those things that we want them to hold on to as they become adults and leaders in our society?
And this dominant narrative that's being pushed by those in the stratosphere here who are discussing the dangers of critical race theory really speaks to one of the core elements of CRT, which is that objective truth doesn't exist, and that truth is a social construction, as is race, and it's created to suit the purpose of the dominant group. And as we see these discussions happening more widely, I think this is a great exemplar of the fact that truth is a social construction and being used by this creation of kind of subjective truths becoming the dominant narrative, and is impacting all of us, and what we hear in the media, and what we hear now even in some of our schools, where teachers are fearful of truth telling. Dr. Caruthers, anything to follow?
Well, there's just a comment in the chat, and I think that is certainly true. Why are race and racism given to be interchangeable when in fact they are two different concepts? One component of race is skin color, which science tells us it is a natural response to sunlight to protect the body. It is racism that is taught, and it is racism that is the problem. And I will certainly agree with that comment.
Yeah. I'm going to stop our screen share.
Thank you, Loyce and Brad. Yes, and we will get to questions here. We have been listening to Dr. Loyce Caruthers and Dr. Brad Poos from the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and we're talking critical race theory. And before we get to questions, I also want to tell you about next Sunday's forum. So tune in next week on this same Zoom channel and hear Leonard Zeskind, author and founder of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. And we'll look at a post. And as we look at a post-Charlottesville, post-January 6th insurrection world, you'll be tackling the questions, how can white supremacists be stopped? So there we go. Lon, you're up.
All right. The question is going to be a curveball, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why is the U.S. military so integrated compared to any other institution in the United States of America?
That is a real interesting question. And, when you think about the military, they started that integration early on. Matter of fact, my son is retired military, and he's been very helpful in sharing some of these issues with me. I think in terms of it was so integrated early on because as America, we were interested in protecting our country, so we almost had to integrate the military. I don't know what your response would be to that, Brad, but that was certainly.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think if we look historically, you take World War II, for example, right, where we can even go back to the Civil War, where certainly we had Black soldiers fighting in segregated units. True of World War II. I mean, we had segregated units. Of course, we had people of color, Black in particular, but fighting in segregated units, returning to a home country then after fighting, off the evils of National Socialism and Hitler and Nazi Germany, Mussolini, etc., and then returning to a home front where their work wasn't valued. I mean, I think, you look at the GI Bill and the fact that Black and brown soldiers were not benefiting from aspects of that GI Bill that favored and supported white returning soldiers. So I think, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question. I mean, I'm not an expert.
It was sort of like their bodies were used in wars, but they couldn't come home and find equal housing.
Right.
They were not a part of that GI Bill in terms of housing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not what I was asking. I know that it was integrated in 49, 48, and now it's become what I was asking. The idea is it's pretty integrated in the military as far as moving up the ladder and other ways of doing things. In other words, it's one of the few institutions in the United States to do that. And I wondered how that was affecting the critical racial theory of how to change a system.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think part of it is opportunity as well. I mean, you talk about integration of the various armed forces. I mean, a lot of times students of color who don't have opportunities as as rich of opportunities to attend four-year universities, who are attending schools that systemically have and systematically have failed them. Those opportunities to join the military is open to all, and become a transition into opportunity. Yeah, I'm not, I don't know that we're answering your question, but I don't know that I really know the answer to that. I'm not a military historian, but I do, we did share a video where
I think
the
it was
discussion
General-
around,
General Mealy at the testifying with the Senate as to why the military was supporting CRT, and the fact that they felt that soldiers had to be aware of the history of this country, and that they did not want to squelch that kind of a truth in terms of that.
Okay,
Thank
Craig
you for what
has
you-
a question.
Thank you.
Craig has a question.
Yeah, thanks so much for this presentation. I'm really, it was very thoughtful, and I'm all with you. But as it went along, I was troubled by the use of all these acronyms and jargon in the explanation of this. Like, are we playing into the hands of these right wingers? When we talk, like, I can foresee them saying, well, we're going to be black mattered, like you had black mattering, you know, or look out, the queer crits are coming for us. And I'm just suggesting that maybe we might need to quit using some of these words. It took me a long time to figure out what they meant. And that makes us vulnerable to these guys who sit around all day thinking of ways to twist our words against us. So in other words, is it really necessary to be, can't we make this a little more understandable?
Yeah,
Well, you
I mean, I
bring
think
up
that's a good point.
a good
Sorry,
point.
Dr. Brothers, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's a very good point, but you had scholars who began to meet as groups to begin to think about and try to sort out all of this. And so you're exactly right. They coined a lot of phraseology in terms of trying to explain some of these issues. And so, yeah, and then as educational theorists, we try to take some of that same language and apply it to what's happening in education. But in terms of many of the scholar attempts of theorizing, we do, as theorists, come up with ways of describing things that sometimes, or oftentimes, the public don't quite understand. And so we have to begin to translate those acronyms and that language into understandable language.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for our purposes here, I mean, we sort of took a more academic tone just in describing and explaining and providing some history. So I think point well taken, and I think you're right. I think that the defense against some of this conservative push to make CRT the boogeyman needs to be simple, toned down, and easy to understand. And so I think certainly we would not take this presentation on the road necessarily in mass media. But yeah, I think your point is well taken.
Thank you.
And I would make, Joe here, the comparison to the same thing happened like with defund police. I mean, it's like, and when you were talking in terms of using the term like counter storytelling, which I know would be understood as being changing the what has been the misappropriation of the misunderstanding of history, but all these things always seem to be it goes against the idea. The idea comes up like it's being that becomes characterized as revisionist, these kind of things. So I know you talk about truth telling. So I guess how if an advertising marketing an agency or whatever were to take this over, what would be the way to go? How do you get the truth seems to be the thing we're after, but even that gets misunderstood?
Well, truth from a constructivist standpoint, each of us come with different truths. And so I think that that's what we have to understand about life. Our experiences will influence our truth. And so truth is much more of an individualized construction rather than a collective construction. So I may tell the story one way and somebody else tells the story the other way, but I also have the right to my story.
Okay, Carol has a question.
Well, my question is from frustration. I mean, I'm seeing this Matthew Hahn, who was fired in Tennessee, and I'm looking at another screen that has a big flag, you know, education, not indoctrination, stop critical race theory now. All these states that are outlawing it, what happened to the freedom, right to speech? I just, how is this not being challenged and losing in the courts? You know, why isn't this the swope monkey trials? It's just crazy. And do you have any ideas on how to make this, fix this? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's, especially as we look at, you know, state legislators who are really taking this on, and again, this fight for objective truth, you know, I think this is going to be a tough battle, and the more we can get information out about what critical race theory is, and the fact that this conservative movement is just blindly throwing everything in the CRT bucket. You know, we have to get that information out there.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was also a reaction overall about our not wanting to talk about race. We are silenced about those issues and how race has influenced our country, and the fact that our country was built on racism. And so those are things that we want to silence. Instead, there's much more of a focus on a narrative of white domination and hegemony. And so people are not willing to bring in other voices. And so a lot of that threatens this whole notion of freedom of speech.
And Karen and Chuck have a question.
I want to get this clear for myself and for Carol, who asks, I think I know where she's coming from. Critical race theory is not the same as teaching Black history, correct?
Correct.
Because I know the schools that I've worked in, we talk about, you know, Black History Month and all of that. So critical race theory is systemic, correct? That's what they're not allowing people to talk about.
That's right.
Correct.
Okay.
Although I think depending on where you are, you know, Black history is being thrown in the CRT bucket. And so now any discussion around race,
difference, right? Any discussion around
difference
right.
is now up for criticism, because it's all being just thrown in the same bucket. Yeah, so that's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
In your School of Education with teachers, do you have advice for teachers how they might confront their concerns, what boundaries they might be looking for, and how they might across them?
Yeah, we work a lot with teachers around, and part of, in the Institute for Urban Education, what we're really charged to do is to help prepare exemplary teachers for our urban schools. And these sorts of conflicts are commonplace now and difficult to navigate. But ultimately, I think it's Bill Ayers talks about having 1 foot in possibility and 1 foot in reality. That's hard to straddle. But we certainly want our students and our teachers to be activists, to be aware and cognizant of the pushback that they're going to receive. But ultimately, we want them to be truth tellers. We want them to be activists, community responsiveness, care for children of all races, creeds, ethnicities, etc. And so, sometimes these are tough calls that involve specific situations, but ultimately that's what we're trying to do, is to create these teachers who are able to navigate a really difficult sea. Dr. Caruthers, you have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to say, when students bring these conversations up in schools, and they will bring them up from their communities and from social media and et cetera, we don't want teachers to close these conversations down, because we're building these critical kinds of conversations about things that affect us as a nation. I just talked to one of my students last night, and she teaches in a white suburban school, and many of her students bring these issues to her as a classroom teacher, and she does not close those conversations down. But yet and still, you have to also, especially with this backlash, she's also very cognizant of how those conversations can be misconstrued. So it's a challenge for teachers in terms of valuing the experiences that kids bring to school, because they are going to bring these experiences to schools, and they are going to comment on these issues.
I want to thank Dr. Loyce Caruthers and Dr. Brad Poos for bringing us a fascinating forum here today. And so, yeah, thank you again.